Welcome back again to Joe Stunner Boxing. I want to talk a bit about someone who, to me, sort of sums up this idea that you take whatever talent you've got and you stretch it to its maximum, its optimum level. You know, you stretch your talent almost to a snapping point, and you get the most out of it. And that someone is Dennis Andries, the old Hackney Rock, who's one of my favourite British champs and British world champs. And Dennis held the WBC title 3 times, which is absolutely amazing considering the path that he had towards winning that title. He was very, very unfancied, a real rough, ready, sort of rugged, tough crew, to be honest with you. I mean, for most of his career, or certainly for the first 2/3 of it, he never really learned how to box. He was a big, strong, extremely tough man, originally from Guyana, came to London, settled in Hackney. His parents did with him, and he was big on the British scene, the domestic scene, for a long while, for some years. Turned pro in 1978, had his last fight in 1996. But it took him, what was it now, 6 years to win the British title, and he held the Southern Area title a couple of times before that. But he only won he only won the British title on his 3rd attempt. And yet he would go on to have international success and world success. So, like I say, Dennis, he turned pro in 78, lost his 3rd fight, won his first 2, lost his 3rd fight to a guy called Bonnie McKenzie, who was a pretty good domestic journeyman. Very difficult, very tough guy to beat, had a losing record by the time he finished his career, but I think he only got stopped about 3 times. Over 37 defeats and 3 stoppages, and he'd also won a few as well. He drew, Dennis did, with Les McAteer, and eventually later that year, I mean, he turned pro in May of 78. I think he had about 8 fights in 7 months or something, and one of those was a victory over Tom Collins. And Tom Collins, like I said, very rough and ready, tough guy himself. Him and Dennis would go on to have a string of fights, and the first one that they had, which was in 78, was won over 8 rounds by Dennis. It was a points decision, and in his following fight, this was in 1979 now, so this is still less than a year since turning pro. He fought a very, very good British fighter, another unsung hero called Bunny Johnson, who was British light heavyweight champ. I think he held the heavyweight championship as well, British heavyweight champ. Terrific fighter, Bunny Johnson. Good, very, very good fighter. Another one who's forgotten. We shouldn't forget these fighters because they're really good fighters. But he lost. He beat Tom Collins in 78 over 8 rounds, and over 10 rounds. This was a non-title fight as well. Bunny Johnson got the better of him. Bunny at the time had 50 wins, 10 defeats, and 1 draw, something like that. And Dennis was still in his first year as a pro. So no shame in losing to Bunny Johnson. Johnson, look him up. He was a good fighter. Well, after that, who did he take on? Tom Collins again. And Tom would go on to hold the British light heavyweight title and would also challenge for the WBC title at one point. He got stopped in 2 rounds, or he quit after 2 or 3 rounds. It was something like that. It was rather an inauspicious title attempt, but he did all right, Tom. He had a pretty good career himself. And Dennis, this time, in 79, KO'd him 6 rounds. It was an 8-rounder. Dennis went on. Got revenge on Bonnie McKenzie, the journeyman who beat him in his 3rd fight, and then he fought Bunny Johnson. Finally, actually, he won the Southern Area title first. That was against Johnny Waldron. Johnny, I think, retired after 10 rounds, and then the following fight, Dennis fought Bunny Johnson for the British light heavyweight title, and he got outpointed over 15 rounds. Okay, no problem. That was in 1980. So this was within the first 2 years of Dennis being a pro, and already he's had a string of fights. But Bunny just knew too much. He was too long in the tooth, too experienced, and too skillful for Dennis, who was, if you see Dennis early on in his career, was very, very crude. He never had a lot of finesse even when he was at world level, but he had some technique eventually taught to him. We'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, Bunny Johnson was just too good and outpointed him over an old 15-rounder. So Dennis carries on. He actually, there was no cruiserweight division at that point. It didn't exist. So Dennis tried his luck at heavyweight, fought David Pearce, who was British at one point was the British heavyweight champ. Piercy stopped him in 7 rounds in an 8-rounder. Dennis was on the floor. I think he was bounced around a bit. Pierce was just too big. Big, tough Welshman, Pierce. Beat Dennis up, floored him, I think, in the 6th and twice in the 7th. Got the better of him, stopped him in 7 rounds. Dennis gets up, dusts himself down like he's supposed to, and then he had his second title shot for the British title, light heavyweight. Went back down to light heavy. Who did he fight? The bloke he'd already beaten twice, once by stoppage, Tom Collins. But this time, in their third meeting, Tom got the better of Dennis over 15 rounds. And yeah, again, Tom Collins, good fighter. And Dennis and Tom had very similar careers. They sort of ran almost parallel. So by this point, they fought 3 times. So Dennis carries on. All right, that's his second British title fight. That, you know, his attempt. He hasn't won it. He lost both from 1 points. One to Bunny Johnson and one to Tom Collins. Then they fought for a 4th time. And I think before that, actually, he won the Southern Area title again. I think he won it twice, the Southern Area title, against Keith Bristol, I think was one of them. I can't remember the other one. But then that gets him a title shot, a British title shot, his 3rd British title shot against the old foe Tom Collins. This is their 4th meeting, and this time it's over 12 rounds, and Dennis wins it. What do you think the first defence was? Well, it's going to be the old foe Tom Collins. So this was the 5th time. I've got this right. The 5th time that they fought. That was a rematch again for the British light heavyweight title, and Dennis won it again over 12 rounds. That was at Watford Town Hall. I'm not too far from where I was living. So at this point, you know, Dennis has established himself as British light heavyweight champ. He defended against Devon Bailey. He carried on, you know, mostly British fighters. He had, I think Jose Sayes was one opponent that was a foreigner, but mostly all his fights, I think, were in Britain. But then he went to America, having been British champ. They tried to take him over to America, and in fact, also into Europe as well. He had a few fights in America against sort of journeymen. Came back to Britain, and I can't remember if it was Mickey Duff or Frank Warren was promoting him, because I think they both did at different points. But anyway, he had an EBU title shot against Alex Blanchard, who was a decent European level fighter, and it was a split draw, over 12. So obviously Blanchard retained the title. So Dennis, still a British light heavyweight champ, but couldn't quite get over the line with the EBU title. So he carries on, and what happens to him? He finally gets the big break. It's the old Rocky thing. He defended his British light heavyweight title against Keith Bristol. That was a 6-round stoppage. And then he fought for the WBC title against JB Williamson, who at the time was 22 wins and 1 defeat. Now this was, I'm sure this was I can't remember whether it was a Duff or a Warren promotion, but anyway, the point is that Williamson was much fancied, but I saw Williamson fight a few times, and he was not a very good fighter. He wasn't a very good WBC champ. And Dennis, being rough and ready and tough and mauling and wrestling, he just outworked him, outmauled him, out-wrestled him, out-punched him, out-fought him. And the next thing you know, by split decision, Dennis Andries is WBC champion of the world. And JB Williamson, like I say, he wasn't a very good champ, not really. And he went on to be a gatekeeper after losing his title. I think that was his first defence as well. So suddenly, Dennis, you know, this was I think about 8 years after he turned pro, from twice losing a light heavyweight British title fights to finally getting hold of the British title and keeping it. Suddenly he's WBC champ. So what does he do? Well, he makes a defence against Tony Simpson, who was really just a fat middleweight. That's how Dennis described him. He said he's a fat middleweight. Don't believe a word he says. And Dennis just chewed him up. He was too physically strong for Tony. Tony was a good game guy. Got stopped in 9 rounds. He was down, I think, 3 times in the 9th round. Dennis stops him. Then Dennis, of course, looking for some big money. What does he do? Over to America, over to Detroit to take on the great Thomas Hearns, the hitman, who at that point of his career was in no shape or form a light heavyweight. He'd actually jumped up from, I believe believe had he gone up from light middle or was it middle? I know Tommy was walking around with weights in his pockets. He just wasn't a light heavyweight, but it didn't matter. He had too much firepower, too much technique for Dennis Andries. He floored him, I think it was about 6 times. And Dennis was rough and ready. He was coming forward. He was getting in close and clubbing Tommy. But Tommy just timed him. Yeah, it was night and day, chalk and cheese regarding technique. And Tommy floored him multiple times and took the WBC title on a 10th round KO. Now, what happened next was really interesting. Because what did Dennis do? We talked about people learning. It doesn't matter whether you lose a fight, you learn from it, you move on, etc., etc. You do your thing. That's exactly what Dennis did. All right, I got beaten up, I got floored half a dozen times. Who cares? Dennis went to Detroit, went back to Detroit to see Manny Steward, and said, "I want you to train me." And Manny Steward thought, "What the hell is this guy talking about?" You know. And so he took a look at Dennis, and Dennis's technique was so bad that Manny Steward had Dennis in with the youngsters, in with the little kids, teaching them footwork, because Dennis had never really learned how to box. He's a fighter. Anyway, Dennis, of course, very, very serious work ethic, very good work ethic. Manny liked that. Manny thought, yeah, this guy's got something about him. I like his attitude. He had a few fights, Dennis did, against 2 fights against journeymen or lesser fighters, shall we say. And then they put him in with Bobby Ches. Bobby Ches was eventually ended up as a light heavyweight and cruiserweight world champ at different times of his career. And surprisingly, even though Ches was a big favourite, Dennis Andries beat him over 10 rounds. He won a decision, which put him back in the pecking order, back in the rankings. He carried on with a few more wins, and eventually he got matched, Dennis did, for the vacant WBC light heavyweight title, which was so this was his second stab at the belt. He was in there against an undefeated fighter called Tony Willis, 16-0 Tony Willis was, much fancied. And again, Dennis upset the apple cart and stopped Willis in 5 rounds, which was a major shock. I remember that fight. It was a shock that he'd actually come back. And he had Manny Steward in the corner. He was working at training at the Kronk gym. Fantastic effort. What a comeback. He then made a first defence against Australia's Jeff Harding and was finally favoured to win. But Jeff Harding, a real tough Aussie, managed to stop Dennis in the 12th round. And I remember that has been quite a shock. And that was in America. But these fights were in America. Dennis had relocated to America and he was working out at Kronk. So what does Dennis do? Having lost his title, he comes back. You know, he got wins over Art Jimmerson, I think was one of them. He fights Jeff Harding again. This is in Melbourne, Australia. This is the second fight between the two of them. In Harding's backyard, and what does he do? Stops him in 7 rounds. So Dennis Andries is now a 3-time WBC light heavyweight champ, and a guy who, you know, it took him 6 years to win the British title. It took him 3 attempts to win the British title. Suddenly, he's a 3-time WBC champ. Well, of course, having stopped Harding in 7 rounds in his backyard, Harding wants revenge. So what does he do? Dennis has, a couple of good wins over some other fighters. He stopped. No, it wasn't a stoppage. It was a unanimous decision over Guy Waters, who was a decent fighter. That was over in Australia as well. And then he takes on Harding again. This was in Hammersmith in London. This is the rubber match. Harding still with just that one defeat on his record. And in fact, Harding, that is a brilliant fight. Go and watch that third fight. I mean, all the fights between Harding and Andries are good, but that third fight is especially brutal. And in fact, Harding won a majority decision in London. So Dennis lost the title for the 3rd time. What does he do? Gets back on the horse, got himself an EBU title shot against Hakim Taifa. Didn't work out. That was over in France. Was it France or Belgium? I think it was France. Lost a majority decision. He had continued to have some good results. David Sewell had only 1 defeat on his record. He was 13-1 when Dennis fought him. Dennis won a 10-round points decision. He stopped Crawford Ashley in 4 rounds, which was a strange sort of catchweight contest at the time. Crawford Ashley would go on to be an EBU light heavy champ and challenge Michael Nunn for the super middleweight belt. Dennis stopped him in 4 rounds. Then he had, I think he lost a fight to Primoslav Salita. That was for, I don't know what that was for. That was for one of those secondary, wasn't that an EBU title fight? I don't think it was. Anyway, eventually, with the cruiserweight division formed, Dennis finally moves up to cruiserweight and tries his luck there, and he actually wins the British cruiserweight title. He stopped Denzel Brown in 11 rounds, which was a terrific performance. You know, Denzel Brown, good domestic level fighter, but then he loses it controversially, the British cruiserweight title, to Terry Dunstan, and a lot of people who watched that fight thought Dennis won that fight. It was a 12-round decision. Dunstan won it. They fought again. Dunstan again beat Dennis on points over 12. And then the final fight in Dennis Andries' career was against Johnny Nelson. And that was for, the British Cruiserweight title. And he got stopped in 7 rounds. And then that was in 1996. And that was Dennis Andries' career. Terrific career. Overachiever. Took the talent he had. Maximised it. What more do you want from a fighter? You know, that's what you want. And Dennis finished his career with 49 wins, 30 KOs, 14 defeats and 4 by stoppage and 2 draws. The Hackney Rock, Dennis Andries, Southern Area Light Heavyweight Champ, Light Heavyweight, British Light Heavyweight Champ, 3-time WBC World Champ and British Cruiserweight Champ. Terrific fighter. From Guyana originally, the Hackney Rock. Fantastic. I love Dennis Andries, great fighter. You know, not technically great, but just great because of what he represents, a true fighting man who overachieved. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you can hit the like button, that's great, or subscribe to the channel if you're new. If you've got any thoughts on Dennis, or if there's any other fighters you'd like me to cover, older fighters, let me know and I'll do a little video on them. I love talking about these old fellas, probably because I am one. But yeah, Dennis Andries, go and check him out. Go and look on YouTube. Don't forget those 3 fights with Jeff Harding, the Australian fella. Fantastic stuff. Anyway, thanks a lot. Leave your comments below and I'll reply to them. And thanks for your time and bye for now.